The security footage showed something that made the investigating officers watch it 3 times in a row. 4 armed men storm a military hospital. Doctors drop to the floor. Nurses scatter. Patients scream. And in the corner of frame 7, a small blonde woman in blue scrubs stands completely still. Not frozen with fear, but watching, cataloging, the way a predator watches prey before it decides to move. Everyone in that hospital believed she was the weakest person in the building. By the time the smoke cleared, she was the only reason any of them were still breathing. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. We post stories like this every week, stories about the people nobody sees coming. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The thing about Coastal Ridge Military Medical Center was that it never quite felt like a hospital. It felt like a waiting room for war. The building sat on the edge of Brenton Bay, Virginia, close enough to the naval base that you could hear jets from the tarmac if the wind was right, close enough that the ER regularly received trauma cases that most civilian hospitals never trained for. Blast injuries, shrapnel removal, blast wave concussion cases that arrived without paperwork and left without explanation. The staff moved differently here than they did at regular hospitals, faster, with less sentiment. Military medical centers had a culture all their own, equal parts discipline and controlled chaos. And the people who thrived inside them tended to be people who had already been through something. Lauren Vasquez had been a charge nurse at Coastal Ridge for 11 years, and she could read a new hire within the first week. She read Mara Sloane in about 40 minutes. Mara had come in on a Tuesday morning in late October, carrying a single canvas bag over one shoulder and a transfer form from the Department of Naval Medicine. 32 years old, brown hair pulled back tight, blue eyes that didn't move much when she talked to you. They just stayed steady, watching, the way certain people's eyes do when they've learned to gather information without letting anyone know they're doing it. Her file said she'd spent 3 years in a civilian trauma center in the Pacific Northwest before requesting the transfer. No red flags. Clean record. Good evaluations. What her file didn't say, what no file could really say, was why someone would voluntarily leave a steady, well-paying job to come work in a military hospital with longer hours, harder cases, and a pay cut. Lauren didn't ask. She had learned not to ask questions that people weren't ready to answer. Instead, she handed Mara a badge, a locker assignment, and a brief tour of the ER layout. Trauma bays are on the left, Lauren said, walking fast and not slowing down to check if Mara was keeping up. We run on a modified military triage protocol. You'll adapt quick or you won't. Either way, I'll know by Thursday. Supply room requires a code. I'll give it to you after you've been here 2 weeks. Don't ask me why, that's just the rule. Locker room is through there. Call lights go to the station, not to individual nurses. We answer as a team or we don't answer at all. Mara followed without commenting. Any questions? Lauren asked, stopping at the nursing station. Where do I put my bag? Lauren stared at her for a beat. Most new hires asked 3 or 4 questions at minimum. Asked about parking, about shift structure, about which attending physicians were difficult. Mara had asked where to put her bag. Locker room, Lauren said. Through there. Mara nodded once and went. Lauren watched her go and thought, that one's been through something. The ER staff noticed her in different ways over the following days. Dex Holloway, one of the senior male nurses who had been at Coastal Ridge for 6 years and acted like it was 20, noticed that she never seemed uncertain about anything. Not in the arrogant way that new hires sometimes pretended, the ones who'd been top of their class and wanted everyone to know it, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. She just moved like she'd already made decisions before the situation finished presenting itself. She could start an IV on her first attempt on patients whose veins were nearly impossible to find. She could read a monitor from across the room and know something was changing before the alarms caught up. What bothered Dex about it was that she never made a point of it. She never looked around to see if anyone had noticed. She just did the thing and moved on. She's too quiet, he told one of the other nurses, Brianna Oakes, during a slow stretch one afternoon. Like nobody's that calm their first week. It's weird. Brianna shrugged. Maybe she's just competent. Nobody starts a new job that competent. You always make at least one mistake. Speak for yourself, Brianna said. But she had noticed too. What Brianna had noticed was the way Mara positioned herself in a room. She always seemed to stand near exits. She always faced doorways. When a difficult patient started escalating, shouting, throwing things, Mara never flinched. She didn't go rigid the way most people did. She just shifted her weight slightly, recalculated, and adjusted her approach. Once, a combative patient in Bay 4 grabbed Mara's wrist hard enough to leave a mark. Mara had looked down at her wrist, then back up at the man, and said in a voice so level it was almost eerie, "I'm going to need you to let go of that." The man let go. Nobody talked about it directly, but they talked around it. The break room conversations had a way of looping back to Mara Sloane without anyone quite intending it. Basang. The one who talked about her most directly was Dr. Patrick Holt. Holt was the kind of physician who had been good at medicine for long enough that he'd started confusing competence with authority. He was 51, attended physician for the ER, and had a habit of speaking to nurses the way people speak to contractors. Not unkindly, exactly, but with a persistent, low-grade implication that they were there to execute, not to think. He and Mara ran into each other properly for the first time at the end of her 4th day, when she flagged a patient she believed was going into early septic shock. The patient was a 46-year-old petty officer who had come in with what looked like a soft tissue infection on his forearm. His vitals were marginal, heart rate elevated, blood pressure on the lower end of acceptable, temperature running at 101.2. Nothing alarming on paper. But Mara had been watching him for 40 minutes, and something about the way his body was moving, subtle, the kind of thing that doesn't show up on a chart, had made her pull up his labs and look harder. She flagged it to Dr. Holt at the station. "His lactic acid is trending up," she said. "It's not in the critical range yet, but his HR has climbed 8 points in the last 30 minutes, and he's starting to look mottled around the knees." Holt glanced at the chart. "He's got a soft tissue infection, Sloane. He's not septic. His MAP is borderline. His MAP is 68. That's borderline." Holt looked at her over his reading glasses with the patient expression of someone who has explained simple things to many people. "I appreciate your attention to detail, but I've been doing this for 23 years, and this patient is not in septic shock. Let's not catastrophize a localized infection." Mara didn't push it. She nodded once and stepped back. But she kept watching the patient, and 40 minutes later, when his blood pressure dropped to 88/52, and the monitor started alarming, she already had a second large-bore IV in her hand, and the sepsis protocol pulled up on the workstation. Holt called for the interventions she'd already staged. He didn't acknowledge it. She didn't expect him to. After that, it became a pattern. Not a hostile one, exactly. More like a quiet, persistent friction. Holt wasn't cruel. He was just the kind of doctor who had built his identity around being the most experienced person in the room, and Mara's presence had a way of quietly disrupting that without her ever trying to. She never argued with him. She never made a point of being right. But she was right often enough, and in ways that were specific enough, that it started to register. One afternoon during a slow shift, Dex Holloway made a joke within earshot of the nursing station. "You know what they say about the quiet ones," he said, not looking up from his chart. "Either they've got nothing going on upstairs, or they've got too much going on and they're hiding it." He paused. "With Sloane, I honestly can't tell which." A few people laughed. Mara was 3 feet away, updating a medication record. She didn't react, just kept typing, then picked up her chart and moved to the next bay. Lauren Vasquez, who had been listening from the supply station, watched Mara go and felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't quite name. By her 3rd week at Coastal Ridge, Mara had developed a routine that was unremarkable on the surface and quietly precise underneath. She arrived 7 minutes before her shift started. Not 10, not 5, 7. She checked in, reviewed the board, and ran a fast mental inventory of what had changed overnight. She knew which attending was on, which nurses she'd be working alongside, which trauma bay had the sticky monitor lead that needed to be pressed in at the corner to read correctly. She learned the building the way she learned everything, methodically, without making a show of it. What she did during her lunch breaks was her own business. Most people ate in the break room or cafeteria. Mara typically took her food to a bench outside near the loading dock where the ambulances came in, ate quickly, and spent the remaining 15 minutes sitting still in a way that looked like rest, but wasn't. Her eyes moved over this perimeter of the building, the side entrance, the delivery access, the security booth at the far end of the lot. Not obviously. Not in the way that would draw attention, just moving, cataloging, the way a certain kind of mind does when it cannot entirely switch off. She had spent years training that part of herself. She had spent the last 3 years trying to put it away. It didn't entirely stay away. The nightmares had gotten better. The hypervigilance had not. She had come to Coastal Ridge because military hospitals were the closest thing she could find to the world she'd left without going back to it. The patients here understood something about the cost of service in a way that civilian patients sometimes couldn't. The work was hard enough to keep her head occupied, and Brenton Bay was far enough from the places she used to go that she could almost believe she was someone new. Almost. She was in the middle of a Thursday evening shift, 3 weeks and 2 days in, by her internal count, when she first saw the man in the black sedan. It was nothing, probably. A car parked in the visitor lot, engine running, no visible occupant in the front seat. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. Security vehicles did this sometimes, sat with the engine on for heat or air conditioning while the officer ran a check or made a call. It was common enough. But this car didn't have a security decal, and it had been parked in the same spot since 4 p.m., which she knew because she'd walked past it on her way in. It was now 6:17. She noted it, filed it, kept moving. An hour later, she walked past the window at the end of the ER corridor and checked the lot out of habit. The car was gone. She turned back to her patient and told herself it was nothing. What? The week that changed everything started quietly. Monday began with a major trauma that came in through the bay doors at 0730. A Navy captain named Rourke, early 50s, who had collapsed during PT and was brought in by base personnel with a preliminary read of cardiac event. By the time the team stabilized him, it was clear it was more complicated than that. He went to the ICU on the 3rd floor, where the attending cardiologist took over and the ER resumed its rhythm. Mara had helped stabilize him during the critical first minutes. She didn't think much about it. It was the job. She thought more about it later. Because when she passed the ICU on her way to lunch, there were 2 men in civilian clothes outside Captain Rourke's door who had the particular stillness of people who did not want to be looked at. They weren't hospital security. Their badges were real. She could see them from 20 feet away. But the posture was military. The way they stood. The way they tracked movement in the hallway with peripheral awareness rather than direct looks. She didn't stop, didn't stare, just walked past and kept going. But something in the back of her mind clicked very softly, like a door that hasn't been locked, pushing open a 1/4 inch in a draft. Tuesday brought Dr. Holt to what Mara had privately started calling a moment. It happened in Bay 3, with a young corporal named Adkins who had come in with a complaint that had been triaged as musculoskeletal pain. He was 24, in good shape, presented with significant lower back pain and some tingling in his left leg. Mara had pulled his chart before the physician came in and had noticed something in the way he described the onset, sudden, without injury, accompanied by a brief episode of numbness in both legs that had resolved before he arrived. She mentioned it to Dr. Holt in the hallway before he went in. Brief bilateral lower extremity numbness on onset, she said, resolved spontaneously. I think it's worth ruling out a cord issue. Holt looked at her the way someone looks at a recommendation they've already decided to discard. He's 24 and he's a sailor. He strained something. The bilateral component is probably positional. He pushed the bay curtain open. I've got it from here. He ordered imaging, lumbar x-rays, standard for back pain. He missed the MRI. Mara put the request in the system and flagged the attending radiologist directly, quietly, without documentation that could be traced back to an override. It was a gray area, and she knew it. The MRI came back 6 hours later, showing a small but significant disc herniation with cord impingement. The corporal was transferred to neurology and scheduled for urgent intervention. Dr. Holt did not thank her. What he did instead was pull Lauren Vasquez aside before the next shift and say, in a voice that was controlled but not comfortable, "Your new hire has a habit of going around the attending physician. I'd like that addressed." Lauren listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "Was the patient harmed?" A beat. "No," Holt said. "Was the outcome better because of what she did?" Another beat, longer. He didn't answer. He walked away. Lauren went back to the nursing station and sat down and looked at Mara Sloane, who was on the other side of the room updating a chart and had no idea any conversation had taken place. The black sedan was back on Wednesday. Different spot this time, closer to the main entrance. Same model, she was almost certain. She couldn't verify the plates from where she stood, but the profile was the same, the color was the same, and it had been there when she arrived and was still there 2 hours into her shift. She told herself again that it was nothing. She started varying her route through the hospital. Small changes, taking different corridors at different times. It was the kind of thing she'd been trained to do so automatically that she was 3 days into doing it before she consciously realized she'd started. She didn't know what she was preparing for. She just knew her body was preparing for something. Thursday evening, 40 minutes before the end of her shift, Dr. Holt came to find her specifically. It was unusual. He usually communicated through the charge nurse or the station. He didn't come to individual nurses unless there was a problem. So when she saw him crossing the floor toward her with his particular purposeful walk, she felt the small, quiet shift in her chest that she'd learned to recognize as her nervous system adjusting its settings. "Sloane," he said, stopping in front of her. "I need to speak with you." She waited. "There's been a concern raised about your conduct on Tuesday, specifically about the radiology order." "I flagged a potential cord impingement directly to the radiologist," she said. "The attending wasn't available for a follow-up consult at the time." "You went outside the chain." "I kept a patient from going home with an undiagnosed cord compression." Something tightened in his jaw. "That's not your call to make. You're a nurse. Your job is to support the physician's plan of care, not substitute your judgment for it." She looked at him steadily. Not aggressively, just steadily. "The patient is in neurology," she said, "and the process is compromised," he said. If you can't operate within the clinical structure here, Coastal Ridge may not be the right fit." She didn't say anything. He held her gaze for a moment, then turned and walked back to the station. Mara stood in the middle of the ER floor for exactly 4 seconds, not moving, not reacting. Then she picked up the chart she'd set down and went back to work. She stayed 20 minutes past the end of her shift to finish her documentation correctly. She took her time. She made sure every entry was clean and time-stamped and indisputable. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. She pushed through the side door into the cool night air and stopped. The black sedan was parked directly across from the exit. Engine off this time. And the driver's window was cracked exactly 2 inches, the way someone cracks a window not for air, but to listen. Mara stood on the top step for a moment. Then she walked to her car without looking directly at the sedan, drove out of the lot without stopping, and took 3 unnecessary turns on the way home to confirm she wasn't being followed. She wasn't. But when she got home, she sat in her car in the driveway for a long time without going inside, and she thought about Captain Rourke in the ICU with the 2 men outside his door. She thought about the sedan. She thought about the way certain patterns collect quietly in the background of a situation before anyone's paying close enough attention to name them. She had been very good once at naming patterns like that. She had spent 3 years trying to stop. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Unknown number, Brenton Bay area code. She stared at it through 2 full rings. Then she picked it up. The voice on the other end was male, low, and said only 4 words before the line went dead. "They're already inside." She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the line went dead. 4 words. That was all. Not enough to act on, not enough to dismiss. The kind of message that was designed to do exactly what it was doing, plant something in the back of her mind and leave it there, growing. They're already inside. Inside what? The hospital? Her apartment building? The base? The words were precise enough to be a warning and vague enough to be useless. And that combination, that specific, deliberate ambiguity, told her something. It told her that whoever had called knew she would understand the shape of it without needing the details filled in. That they were speaking to a version of her that she had been working very hard to leave behind. She called the number back. Nothing. Not even a ring. The line was already dead in the technical sense. Disconnected, spoofed, whatever method someone used when they needed to say a thing once and leave no trace of having said it. She put the phone on the seat and looked at her front door. The porch light was on. She always left it on. The door was locked. She'd checked it twice before leaving this morning, the way she always did. the way she'd been doing since before most people she knew had any reason to check their door locks twice. The street was quiet. A dog was barking 2 houses down, which was normal because that dog barked at everything from raccoons to weather changes, and she'd learned in her first week here to filter it out. Everything looked exactly as it should. That, if anything, was what bothered her. She got out of the car, went inside, and spent the next 3 minutes doing a walkthrough of every room that she would have been embarrassed to admit to anyone who didn't already know what she used to do for a living. She checked closets. She checked the window in the back bedroom that had a slightly loose latch. She checked the space under the bed, which she knew intellectually was an absurd thing to do and did anyway, because her body was running a program that her rational mind had limited authority over. Nothing was out of place. She sat down at the small kitchen table and made herself eat something. Reheated rice and vegetables from the night before, fuel more than food, and tried to think through it cleanly. Captain Rourke, ICU, 3rd floor. 2 men in civilian clothes outside his door. The sedan. The call. None of those things, individually, added up to anything definitive. Taken together, they sketched the outline of something she recognized. She had spent years learning to read that outline before it filled in, because by the time it filled in, it was usually too late to do anything useful. The question was whether she was reading a real pattern or inventing one, because a part of her brain was still wired for that kind of reading and couldn't find enough to do in a trauma ER in Virginia. She washed her dishes. She went to bed. She slept badly, which was not unusual. And at 3 a.m. she was awake and staring at the ceiling with the particular clarity of thought that sometimes came at that hour. Not the muddy, anxious rumination of stress, but something sharper and colder. More like calculation. They're already inside. She made a decision before the sun came up. She arrived at Coastal Ridge 45 minutes before her Friday shift began, which was early even by her own standards. The morning was cold, the sky a flat, iron gray over the bay, and the parking lot was mostly empty except for the overnight staff vehicles and a utility truck near the loading dock. No black sedan. She noted its absence the way she noted everything, without dwelling on it, but without forgetting it either. She badged in through the side entrance and went directly to the 3rd floor before anyone had a reason to question why she was there. The ICU had its own rhythm at 0615, quieter than the ER, more controlled, the kind of stillness that was managed rather than natural. 2 nurses were at the station doing handoff. She recognized one of them, a day shift nurse named Paulette, who occasionally came down to the ER for supplies and always stopped to talk longer than she needed to. "Early day?" Paulette asked without looking up from her charting. "Paperwork," Mara said. It was a sufficient answer in a place where everyone ran behind on documentation. She walked the length of the ICU corridor at a pace that looked purposeful, like someone who had a destination, not someone who was looking at things. Captain Rourke's room was at the far end, room 14. The door was closed. The 2 men who had been outside it 2 days ago were not there now, but there was a single chair positioned against the wall beside the door that had not been there on Monday. A chair that someone had placed there deliberately, for someone to sit in who would want a clear line of sight to the hallway in both directions. The chair was empty right now, but it had been used recently. The seat cushion was slightly compressed in a way that a chair sitting unused would not be. Someone had been sitting there within the last couple of hours. She did 1 full loop of the corridor, came back to the elevator, and went down to the ER. By the time her shift started at 0700, she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. A nurse who had shown up a little early, clocked in, reviewed the board, and was ready to work. The morning moved fast, the way Friday mornings at military hospitals often did, a cluster of cases that had been held through the week coming in at once, combined with the particular category of injuries that happened when service members had the beginning of a weekend in sight and made decisions accordingly. Mara worked through it without thinking too hard about anything except what was directly in front of her, which was by design. The ER was the one place where the noise in her head got quiet because there was enough real noise to drown it out. She was in Bay 2 managing a laceration repair when Dex Holloway appeared at the curtain. "Sloane, Holt wants you at the station." She looked up from what she was doing. "I'm mid-procedure." He said, "Now." She looked at her patient, a young second lieutenant with a 4-inch laceration on his forearm, who was lying very still and doing an admirable job of pretending he wasn't uncomfortable. "I'll be 3 minutes," she said to Dex. Then, to the patient, Don't move that arm. She finished the closure, dressed it cleanly, gave the lieutenant his aftercare instructions, and walked to the nursing station where Dr. Holt was waiting with Lauren Vasquez and a woman Mara didn't recognize. Early 50s, civilian clothes, the precise kind of unremarkable that certain professionals cultivated deliberately. Sloane, Holt said. He had a specific expression that she'd come to recognize over the past 3 weeks, the look of someone who had decided something and needed to say it out loud to make it official. We're formalizing the concern I raised with you yesterday. There'll be a written notice in your personnel file regarding the unauthorized radiology order. Mara looked at Lauren. Lauren's face was carefully neutral. Understood, Mara said. Additionally, Holt glanced at the woman beside him. There's a question about some access you ran through the system this week, the third-floor ICU records. Mara had not accessed any ICU records. She had walked the corridor. She had not touched a single system terminal. I don't have third-floor access, she said. Someone used your badge number. The statement landed quietly in the space between them. She kept her face very still. Then someone used my badge number. The woman in civilian clothes spoke for the first time. Her voice was measured, not unkind, and completely uninformative about what she actually thought. We're not making an accusation at this stage, but until this is clarified, we're going to ask that you limit your activity to your assigned department. That's already where I work, Mara said. Yes, the woman said, and left it at that. She got through the rest of the shift on autopilot, which was something she'd been able to do since she was 23 years old, and had first learned that the body could continue performing technically demanding tasks while the mind worked on something else entirely. She started IVs, she managed vitals, she talked to patients in the calm, even tones she'd developed that tended to make people less frightened without being falsely cheerful about whatever was actually happening to them. She did all of it correctly. Underneath it, she was running the math. Her badge number had been used to access ICU records. She had not done it, which meant either the system had made an error, possible, but unlikely, or someone had deliberately used her badge number to pull records they didn't want attached to their own credentials, which meant someone inside the hospital knew her badge number and had either cloned it or used it through a system vulnerability, which meant that the message on her phone last night, "They're already inside," was not metaphorical. She thought about Captain Rourke in room 14. She thought about the chair against the wall. She thought about what someone would need from an ICU patient's records if they were planning something, rather than just monitoring something. Medical records contained drug schedules. They contained care protocols. They contained the information you would need if you wanted to know when a patient would be at his most vulnerable, when his medications peaked, when monitoring checks occurred, when shift changes created brief gaps in coverage. The thought arrived in her head with a cold, specific weight, and she moved her afternoon around it without letting it show. At 14:30, she found Lauren Vasquez in the supply room. I need 2 minutes, Mara said, closing the door. Lauren turned around. She had a look on her face that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. The badge access, Mara said. When was it logged? I can't share that with you. Lauren. Mara, I cannot. When? A pause. Lauren put down the supplies she was holding, looked at the middle distance for a moment, then said quietly, last night, between 0200 and 0230. Mara had been home at 0200. She had been sitting at her kitchen table eating reheated rice. Did the access include medication schedules, she asked. Lauren's expression shifted, something crossing it briefly that wasn't surprise so much as confirmation of a suspicion she'd been trying not to have. I'm not going to answer that. That's an answer, Mara said. She opened the door and walked out. She took her lunch break at the bench near the loading dock and ate without tasting anything, and she thought about what she needed to do and in what order and what the consequences of each option were. She could go to hospital security, but hospital security was institutional, which meant slow. And slow was only useful if she was wrong about the timeline. If she was right about it, slow was a catastrophe. She could call the number that had called her. She had already tried that. She could contact someone from her previous life, which was the option she had spent 3 years making a systematic point of not doing, because every time you pulled a thread from a life you'd left behind, you pulled more than the one thread, and she was not ready for what would come with it. She was not sure she would ever be ready for that, or she could stay inside the building, stay visible, and watch. She was halfway through this inventory of bad options when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Different number from the call, but the same area code. The text was 4 words again, because apparently whoever this was had an aesthetic commitment to brevity. Saturday night. Room 14. She read it twice, then she deleted it. Not because she needed to. The number would be a dead end the same as the last one, but because she had a habit of not leaving things in places where other people could find them. Saturday night was tomorrow. What? She spent Friday evening doing what she did not want to do. She opened a laptop she kept in the closet, different machine from the one she used for streaming and online banking, older, the kind of thing she'd maintained the way some people maintain a go bag, without a specific plan for needing it, but with the quiet understanding that the day might come. She ran it through a VPN she hadn't used in 14 months, and spent 2 hours pulling everything she could find from publicly accessible records about the naval command structure at Brenton Bay, about Captain Rourke's publicly acknowledged role. Surface level, nothing classified, the kind of biographical outline that existed in congressional testimony archives and service records that had been through FOIA, and about the pattern of what she was seeing. What she found did not make her feel better. Captain Rourke, his full name was Captain Douglas Rourke, had spent the last 3 years as the logistics and operational coordinator for a classified Navy procurement program. The details of the program were not publicly available. The fact that it existed was inferable from a chain of publicly available budget line items if you knew what you were looking at and had the patience to look. She had both. The program was the kind of thing that created enemies. Not personal enemies, but institutional ones. The kind of enemies that operated through channels and used people who were good at not being seen. The chair outside room 14 made a different kind of sense now. So did the sedan. So did the badge access. So did the call. She shut the laptop at midnight, sat in the dark for a while, and had a conversation with herself that she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She had left that life because she was tired and because she had made mistakes, and because the weight of what she'd been part of had become heavier than she knew how to carry. She had come to Coastal Ridge because she still wanted to help people in a way that didn't require her to become something she wasn't comfortable being anymore. But she was also sitting in her house in the dark doing threat assessments on a naval captain's room at a military hospital because some part of her had never stopped. The question was not whether she was capable of doing something about what was coming. The question was whether she was willing to. She went to bed and did not answer it. Saturday started the way Saturdays at Coastal Ridge usually did. The building running at a reduced staff pattern, the pace slightly slower in the morning before it ramped up in the afternoon, the particular atmosphere of a weekend shift that was neither relaxed nor tense, but something in between. Mara clocked in at 0700 and worked her section of the ER with the kind of quiet consistency that had characterized every one of her shifts since she'd started here. She was not someone who performed wellness, but she was careful, today, not to perform anything else either. Dex was working the same shift. He was in a slightly better mood than usual, which was either because it was Saturday or because the written notice in Mara's file had satisfied some internal score he was keeping. She didn't speculate about it beyond that observation. Dr. Holt was not on today. The attending was Dr. Rachel Yoon, younger than Holt, less territorial, the kind of physician who listened when nurses talked and made decisions quickly without feeling the need to narrate her authority while doing it. Mara had worked 2 shifts with Yoon before and had found her straightforward in the best sense of the word. The morning was manageable. The afternoon picked up. 3 trauma cases in 2 hours, overlapping in the way trauma cases do at military facilities, where the injuries tend to be more complex and the patients tend to underreport pain because they've been trained to, and that habit doesn't fully switch off when they come through the ER doors. Mara worked through all 3, ran her documentation, managed a family in the waiting room who were frightened and needed someone to talk to them honestly rather than vaguely, and ate half a sandwich standing at the station at 15:30 because there was no time to do it properly. By 1800, the ER had quieted enough that she could feel the edges of the day beginning to compress, that late shift narrowing where the building got quieter and the gaps between activity grew longer, and the part of her mind she'd been keeping occupied all day started to resurface. Room 14. Saturday night. She did not know what form it would take. She knew enough to know that she did not have a complete picture. The badge access had pulled medication schedules. She was nearly certain of that based on Lauren's non-answer. which suggested the timing of a vulnerability had been identified. The sedan had been running surveillance on the building for at least 3 days. The two men outside Rourke's door were protective detail, which meant someone in the official chain already knew there was a threat and was managing it, but managing it at the official level, which meant paperwork and protocols, which meant the kind of response that was visible and procedural and could potentially be read by the same people who were planning whatever was planned for tonight. The thing about certain kinds of operational threats was that they accounted for the official response. They planned around it. They found the gap between the checkpoint at 0200 and the next check at 0230 because they'd pulled the records that told them exactly where that gap was. She clocked off at 1900, walked to her car, drove 2 blocks away, and parked. And then she sat there and made the decision she'd been making and unmaking for the last 48 hours. She thought about the man she hadn't saved. She thought about the weight she'd walked away carrying. She thought about why she'd come here. The genuine, non-tactical reason, underneath all the vigilance and the habits she couldn't turn off. She had come here because she wanted to do something that helped people without costing anyone anything, without the kind of cost she'd already paid and watched others pay. She thought about a man in a hospital bed in room 14 who did not know what was coming for him tonight. She got out of the car. She didn't go back through the main entrance. She went around to the loading dock entrance, which she knew from her lunch break walks was monitored by a camera with a 12-second sweep cycle and a blind spot on the left side of the dock platform. She badged in with her own credentials. No reason to hide she was an employee. Her presence in the building on her day off was unusual but not impossible to explain, and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. The ICU corridor was quiet. The overnight nurse was at the far end of the station, head down over a chart. The chair outside room 14 was occupied. One of the 2 men she'd seen before, sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at his phone. She walked toward him. He looked up when she was about 10 feet away, and she watched his posture shift. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way trained people shift when an unknown quantity enters their controlled environment. "This floor is restricted to staff and authorized visitors," he said. She held up her badge. "I'm staff. ER staff. This is the ICU. I have a patient up here I've been following," she said, which was not technically true but was not a lie that would be quickly verifiable. "I'm Dr. Yoon's nurse on the Calloway case in room 11. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with the specific quality of blankness that she'd learned to produce. Not vacant, just present and unthreatening. The kind of look that said, "I work here, I'm tired, please let me do my job." He settled back slightly. "Fine. Keep it brief." She nodded and walked past him toward room 11. She spent 4 minutes in room 11, which was occupied by a post-surgical patient named Calloway, who was asleep and whose chart she reviewed with the focused attention of someone doing exactly what they said they were doing. Then she came back out and walked past the man in the chair, who had returned to his phone, and went to the stairwell. She stopped on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floor and stood very still and listened to the building. It was 1948. She thought about what she would need. She thought about what she didn't have. She thought about what was in the ER supply room 2 floors below her, and what was in the staff locker room on the 1st floor, and what she was actually planning to do with any of it. She was still working through that when she heard the sound. It was subtle, the kind of thing that most people wouldn't register. A door below her, in the stairwell, that had been opened and closed with the specific care of someone who did not want to make noise. Not the casual pull and let go of someone moving between floors normally. The deliberate, controlled close of someone who was being precise about it. She went very still. A second sound. Below her. Someone on the 1st floor landing. She moved upward without making a decision to move, because her body had already made the decision. She went up to the 3rd floor door and threw it quietly, back into the ICU corridor, and the man in the chair looked up at her with an expression that shifted from annoyed to alert when he read whatever was on her face. "You need to call this in," she said, her voice low and level. "Right now. There's someone in the south stairwell." He was already reaching for his radio, and from somewhere below them in the building, as if in response, the fire alarm went off. Not the full evacuation alarm, just the localized alert on the 3rd floor circuit, the kind of pull that cleared a specific area and created movement and confusion and sent staff toward exits, pulling attention away from the places that needed it most. The man in the chair stood up fast. He pressed his radio and said something into it that she didn't hear over the alarm. Mara looked at the door to room 14. She looked at the stairwell she'd just come out of. She looked at the corridor, two nurses already moving, heads up, uncertain whether to run the evacuation protocol or hold position, one of them looking at Mara because Mara was the only person in the hallway who wasn't visibly reacting to the alarm. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and closed her hand around the one thing she'd picked up from her car before coming back inside. Not a weapon, not exactly, just a tool she'd carried for so long that having it felt like nothing, and not having it would have felt like something missing. The alarm kept screaming, and the door to the stairwell opened from the inside. The door swung open hard and fast, the way doors open when someone behind them is moving with intention rather than caution, and Mara was already in motion before she consciously processed what she was seeing. Two men. Not the careful, controlled movement of security personnel. These two came through fast and tight, one high and one low, in the stacked entry pattern of people who had trained for closed spaces and expected resistance. The first one was through before the man in the chair had his radio fully raised. The second one came in right behind, and in the half-second between their entry and the moment the situation fully resolved into something actionable, Mara had already done three things. She'd moved left out of the fatal funnel, she'd registered that both men were carrying, holstered, not drawn, which meant they hadn't expected to need weapons immediately, and she'd noted that neither of them had looked at her yet. They were looking at the man in the chair. She understood, in that compressed fraction of a second, that she was still reading as staff to them. Just a nurse in the wrong place at the wrong time, irrelevant, something to manage and push aside. She let them keep thinking that for exactly as long as it was useful. The first man hit the chair guard with a controlled strike that was designed to incapacitate without killing, a palm strike to the temple, the kind of hit that drops someone without the noise of a firearm and with enough plausible deniability that it could be characterized as a fall if you needed it to be. The guard went down hard, and the radio clattered across the floor and skidded under the nursing station counter. The second man turned to Mara. "Down," he said. Not loud, very flat. The voice of someone who gave this kind of instruction regularly and expected it to be followed. She looked at him. She looked at his hands. She looked at the angle of his body. Then she went to her knees, hands visible, exactly the way someone would if they were frightened and complying, because the most important thing right now was the two ICU nurses at the end of the corridor who were standing frozen in the alarm noise and staring, and she needed these men to believe the situation was controlled. The second man moved past her toward room 14. The first man was already at the door, card in hand. A cloned credential, she assumed, because the door clicked open without resistance. She waited 2 full seconds. Then she came off the floor. She didn't announce it. She didn't hesitate. She went from her knees to upright in one continuous movement and crossed the distance to the second man in 4 steps. And what happened next took 11 seconds in total and was ugly and imperfect in ways that she would think about afterward. The way things always were when you actually did them rather than trained them. She caught his right arm before he fully registered she was moving. He was bigger than her by 40 pounds at minimum, which meant leverage was her entire argument, and she used it, twisting his arm into a position his shoulder joint was not designed to tolerate, forcing him into the wall to his left, because she needed him stationary, and she needed him now, and she needed him not to have enough stability to reach for the weapon at his hip. He was good. He recovered faster than most people would have. I used the wall as a redirect and came back with his elbow hard, and it caught her across the left cheekbone, and she felt the impact in a flat, bright, clarifying way. Not pain exactly. Not yet. Just information. And she tucked and rolled with it rather than absorbing it straight, because absorbing it straight would have put her on the floor. She came up with his arm still compromised and drove her knee into his lateral quadriceps, which was not a theatrical move but a practical one, because the large muscle group seizing from a targeted strike would drop his mobility faster than almost anything else available to her. He went to one knee. She came down on his neck with her forearm and held it there with the specific controlled pressure that cut off blood flow without crushing the airway, because crushing the airway created a medical emergency that complicated everything downstream. 8 seconds. 10. He stopped fighting. 12. She held it 2 seconds longer than she needed to, and then let him down as cleanly as she could, which was not very clean. He hit the floor at an angle, and the sound of it was louder than she wanted. She was already turning when she heard the door to room 14 close from the inside. The first man had gotten through. She hit the door at a run and shoved it with her shoulder because pulling it open would have cost a fraction of a second she didn't have, and she came into the room with her hands up and her body already pivoting to read the layout before she fully registered what was in it. Captain Douglas Rourke was in the bed, semi-reclined, and he was awake, which she hadn't expected, his eyes wide and alert in the particular way of someone who has been trained to come to full consciousness fast, and had done it. He was catheterized, and he had a central line and 2 peripheral IVs, and he was in no condition to be out of that bed, which meant the bed was where the geometry of this needed to resolve. The first man was standing between Mara and the bed. He had his weapon out now, not aimed at Roark, aimed at her, because she'd come through the door, and she'd come through it like someone who was not frightened, and that had recalibrated his assessment of the situation. The alarm was still going outside. "Close the door," the man said. She didn't close the door. "I will not ask you twice." "You've already asked me once," she said, and her voice came out level, which surprised her slightly because her heart was running at a rate that she could feel in her fingertips. "And you don't want to shoot me in here. It's loud, it's traceable, and the room is small enough that the risk of a through and through into that bed is not 0. Something moved across his face. Not uncertainty. He was too trained for uncertainty, but a recalculation. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm the person who just put your partner on the floor outside," she said. "So whatever answer you were expecting, it's probably not that one." She watched him think. It was a fast calculation, and it happened in about 2 seconds, and she watched every variable of it in the set of his jaw and the adjustment of his weight. He made a decision. He moved toward her instead of toward Rourke, which told her he was tactical enough to recognize that she was the immediate problem, and she respected the logic of it even as she committed to the counter. She went inside his extension, inside the arm with the weapon, which was the counterintuitive direction and the correct one because outside the weapon was where most people went, and he would have anticipated outside. She caught his wrist with both hands and drove it upward, and the gun discharged into the ceiling with a sound that was enormous in the enclosed space, and then she had his wrist locked at an angle that made the weapon a liability for him, and she stripped it with her right hand and had it for exactly 3 seconds before she made the decision to put it under the bed rather than keep it, because she was not going to shoot anyone in an ICU room if she had any other option, and also she was not willing to have a reason to need to. He adjusted fast, too fast, which meant he was better trained than the one in the corridor, and she took a hit to the solar plexus that folded her briefly and genuinely, and she used the fold as a crouch rather than a collapse, which worked, and came back up with both forearms raised. The exchange that followed lasted 40 seconds, and was not something she would have been able to narrate coherently even immediately afterward. She took 2 more hits, one to the shoulder, one that grazed her left ear and rocked her head sideways, and she gave back considerably more than that through a combination of trained sequencing and the specific advantage she had in this space of wanting very badly not to damage anyone in that bed behind her. When it was over, the man was on the floor and she was bleeding from a split at her cheekbone from the earlier hit and breathing in a way that was not controlled and not quiet. Rourke said, from the bed, "The door." She turned. The door was still open. She went to it and looked into the corridor. The second man was still down. The alarm was still screaming. One of the ICU nurses, the one who'd been at the far end, was pressed against the wall with her phone in her hand and her face completely white. "Lock down this floor," Mara said. "Call security right now. Tell them there are 2 individuals down in the 3rd floor ICU corridor. Tell them you need backup at room 14. Can you do that?" The nurse stared at her. "Say yes if you can do that." "Yes," the nurse said. Her voice was barely audible. "Good. Stay where you are and make the call." Mara looked down the corridor one more time, verified the second man was still not moving, and then closed the room 14 door and turned back to Rourke. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not the wide, alarmed look from when she'd come through the door, but something narrower and more focused, the look of someone who was running his own assessment and was somewhere in the middle of it. "You're not my protective detail," he said. "No. Who are you?" She went to the man on the floor of his room, checked his pulse, present, strong, he was unconscious but stable, and pulled a zip tie from the interior pocket of her jacket because she had put 2 of them there before coming back into the building, and she was very glad she had. She secured his wrist to the base of the bed frame with a knot that would hold. "I'm the ER nurse who flagged your medication schedule access," she said. "Someone pulled it 2 nights ago using my badge number. I was trying to figure out what they needed it for." "And?" "Shift change vulnerability between 0200 and 0230, and apparently a Saturday." Rourke looked at the man on his floor. He looked at the door. He looked at Mara. "The detail outside. One man, and he's down. I don't know if these two were all of them." The word all hung in the air between them, with the specific weight of a question neither of them could answer yet. The alarm cut out 9 minutes after it had started, which meant someone had reached the pull station, or the system had cycled through its alert protocol, and the silence that replaced it was the kind that felt louder than the alarm had been. Mara could hear her own breathing in it, and she worked on steadying it, not from panic, from exertion, which were physiologically identical and required the same management. She checked her cheekbone with 2 fingers. The skin was split, and it was bleeding in a slow, steady way that would need a closure strip at minimum, and probably a stitch. She'd had worse. She pressed the heel of her hand against it and held pressure and thought about what came next. What came next arrived in less than 4 minutes. 3 hospital security officers through the main ICU door, then 2 more through the stairwell, and then people in federal credentials who had apparently been in this building already and had been running toward the sound of the gunshot since it happened. The discharge had been contained by the room walls, but not by the room walls entirely, and in a hospital this quiet at night, a gunshot was a sound that pulled everyone with a radio toward its source. The next 20 minutes were the controlled chaos of a situation being locked down after the fact. The second man in the corridor was cuffed and treated for the cervical compression she'd applied, which had left him with a headache and a temporary reduction in blood pressure, and nothing more serious than that. The man in room 14 was secured and was conscious by the time the federal officers got to him, which created its own set of problems that she was not going to be involved in resolving. The guard from the chair, the one who'd taken the temple strike, had a grade 2 concussion and was being evaluated 2 rooms down. Mara sat on the floor of the corridor outside room 14 with her back against the wall and her knees up and a gauze square pressed to her cheekbone, and watched it all happen. Nobody told her to move. Nobody told her to stay. She existed in the gap between those 2 instructions, which was a gap she'd occupied before and knew how to be in. A woman in a federal credentials jacket crouched in front of her at the 19-minute mark. She had a short, no-nonsense haircut, and the manner of someone who was running on information she was not going to share until she decided it was relevant to. "Mara Sloane," the woman said. "Yes." "Walk me through it." So she did. Clinically, sequentially, without embellishment or apology. The sedan, the phone calls, the badge access, what she'd observed about the chair placement and the shift change window, what she'd done and in what order and why. She did not frame it as anything more than what it was. A series of observations and decisions made in sequence, each one following from the last. The woman listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, the woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You stripped his weapon." "Yes." "And put it under the bed." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wasn't going to use it, and I didn't want it accessible to him." The woman looked at her for a long moment. "What did you do before this?" she said. "Before the nursing." Mara pressed the gauze harder against her cheekbone. "I was in the military." "What did you do in the military?" A pause. "Something else," Mara said. The woman stood up. She pulled out a card and handed it down without comment. "Don't leave the building tonight. We're going to need to talk." She walked away. Watch. Lauren Vasquez arrived at 21:40, which meant she'd been called in on her night off, which meant someone had put her name somewhere on a notification list that Mara hadn't known about. She came through the ICU doors looking like someone who had driven here with a specific expression already formed and had been maintaining it since she got in the car. Not angry, exactly, but the kind of carefully controlled that requires effort. She stopped in front of Mara and looked at the gauze and the blood and the expression on Mara's face, and whatever she'd come here prepared to say underwent some revision. "Are you hurt?" she said. Not quite a question. "I need a closure strip on the cheekbone, and I'm going to have a significant bruise on the left shoulder by morning." "But no," Mara said. "Not in a way that matters." Lauren sat down on the floor next to her, which was not something Mara had expected, and they sat there together in the corridor with federal agents moving around them, and neither of them said anything for a full minute. "The badge access," Lauren finally said. "Someone cloned my number and pulled Rourke's medication schedule. They needed the gap in the overnight monitoring protocol." "I know. They've been through the system logs." A pause. "I should have told you more when you asked me." "You told me what you could." "I should have told you more," Lauren said again, which was the kind of statement that didn't have an answer and didn't need one. A federal officer walked past them with one of the detained men, the one from the corridor, in flex cuffs, and both women watched him go in silence. "Who are these people?" Lauren said. "I don't know all of it yet, but Rourke's program had people who wanted it stopped. Not through channels." She paused. "That's about the shape of what I know." "The shape is enough to be going on with," Lauren said. They sat in silence for another moment. Through the door to room 14, which was now open and attended by 2 federal agents, Mara could see Rourke in his bed, sitting more upright now, alert, speaking to someone at his bedside. He looked like a man who had just had a very bad evening and was already working out what to do about it, which she thought was probably a reasonable description of what he was. She thought about the man she'd secured to the bed frame. She thought about the strike to her solar plexus and the one to her shoulder, and the way 40 seconds of that kind of exchange always felt like 4 minutes, and cost more than the training made it seem like it should. She was very tired. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been forced to use it, and the using of it reminded her of both why she'd set it down and why she'd never been quite able to put it all the way down. The woman with the federal credentials came back at 2155. She had someone with her this time, a man in a different kind of jacket, older, the kind of face that suggested he'd been in rooms like this many times, and had developed a quality of stillness that was not calm, but was the close relative of calm. He looked at Mara with the specific attention of someone who had already read something about her and was now reconciling the reading with the person. "Agent Nora Fisk," the woman said. "This is Deputy Director Callum Reeves, Naval Criminal Investigative Service." Reeves looked at Mara for a long moment. "Ms. Sloane," he said, "I think we've been looking for you for about 3 years." Mara looked at him. Her face did what it did when she was choosing not to show anything, which was not nothing, exactly, but close enough to nothing that most people couldn't read what was underneath it. "Looking for me," she said, "or looking for someone who could do what I did tonight?" Reeves considered this. "Both," he said. "Honestly." She looked at the card in her hand, Fisk's card. She looked down the corridor at the man in the chair who was now a man in a hospital bed 2 rooms down with a concussion. She looked at room 14. "The 2 men you detained," she said. "Who sent them?" "That's part of what we need to talk about." He paused. "There are 3 more." She felt something in her chest. "3 more what?" Lauren said beside her. Reeves looked at Mara, not at Lauren. He was making sure Mara understood what he meant before he said it out loud. 3 more individuals we believe are part of the same network," he said, 2 of whom we've been tracking for 6 weeks. One of whom, he paused again, and she noticed he chose his words carefully. "We have reason to believe entered this building tonight and has not yet been located." The corridor was quiet. Mara looked at the length of it. She looked at the stairwell door at the far end, which had been propped open by one of the security officers and was currently unattended. She looked at the single camera above the nursing station that covered the main section of the corridor, but not the alcove beside the medication room. She was already counting the gaps when Reeves said, "We've been through the building twice." "There's a sub-level maintenance corridor," she said, "below the basement. It connects to the east wing through a utility access that's on the facilities map, but not on the standard security sweep checklist." She'd found it on her 3rd day, doing exactly what she did every time she came somewhere new. "If someone had the building schematics, how do you know about the maintenance corridor?" Fisk said. "Because I walked it," Mara said simply. "The day I arrived." Fisk and Reeves looked at each other. Then Reeves looked back at Mara with that careful, assessing expression and said, "We need you to take us there." She stood up. Her shoulder protested loudly, and she let it, acknowledged the signal without letting it change the answer. "I need a radio," she said, "and I need one of your people behind me at 20 feet, not 10, 20. If I'm right about the corridor and we go in stacked, we lose the approach advantage." You're telling me how to run this, Fisk said. Not a criticism, a confirmation. I'm telling you what works in a space that size, Mara said. You can run it however you want. Fisk looked at her for a long moment. Then she held out her radio. Mara took it. Lauren was still sitting on the floor looking up at her with an expression that Mara couldn't quite read. Not shock, because Lauren had apparently exhausted whatever shock she'd brought with her on the drive over, but something more complex. The look of someone who has been working next to a person for weeks and has just understood that they didn't have most of the information. I'll be back, Mara said. That's not reassuring, Lauren said. I know. She looked at Lauren for one more second. Don't let anyone move Rourke off this floor. Then she turned and started toward the far stairwell, and Reeves fell in behind her at the distance she'd asked for, and Fisk was on the radio calling positions before they reached the door. The stairwell was cold and the fluorescent on the lower landing was flickering. Had been flickering since she'd first used this route, a maintenance issue that nobody had gotten to. It threw the shadows wrong, made depth perception slightly unreliable in the turns. She went down 2 floors to the basement level and then to the door at the end of the east corridor that most people walked past because it was unmarked and beige and had the general appearance of a supply closet. She put her hand on it and paused. From behind it, barely perceptible through the fire door's thickness, came the soft metallic sound of something, a latch, a case, a tool, being set down carefully on a concrete floor. She turned to look at Reeves. He'd heard it too. She held up one finger and then pointed down, below us, and then made a flat gesture with her palm. Wait, and looked at him until he nodded. She put her hand on the door handle. Her heart was running at the same elevated rate it had been since the stairwell on the second floor, and her shoulder was a steady, unreasonable complaint, and the gauze she'd pressed to her cheek was long gone, and she could feel the slow persistence of the split there, and she thought, clearly and briefly, that she was 32 years old and standing in a hospital basement in the dark about to open a door, and that there was apparently no version of her life that did not eventually lead back to this. She opened the door. The maintenance corridor was long and narrow and lit by a single strip of emergency lighting that ran the length of the ceiling in intervals, casting everything in the flat amber of power conservation mode. Pipes ran along both walls. The floor was raw concrete, gray and old, with the kind of stain pattern that came from decades of minor leaks and drainage. At the far end of the corridor, 70 feet away, a figure knelt over an open case. He looked up at the same moment she did, and in the flat amber light, across 70 feet of concrete and pipe and industrial silence, they looked at each other, and she understood 2 things simultaneously, that this was the third man, and that the open case at his knees was not a weapon. It was a detonator assembly. The corridor was rigged. For 2 full seconds, neither of them moved. It was the kind of stillness that happens when 2 people simultaneously understand that the next decision will determine everything that comes after it, and both of them are running that calculation at the same time. Mara had been in moments like this before. Not many, but enough that she recognized the particular quality of them, the way time seemed to thicken and slow without actually doing either. The man at the far end of the corridor was in his mid-40s, she estimated. Medium build, dark jacket, dark trousers, the kind of clothing that was chosen for not catching light. His hands were still inside the open case, and she could see from 70 feet that he was deciding whether to finish what he was doing or abandon it, and that those were not equally weighted options for him. She made a decision in the space of a breath. She did not charge him. She did not call out to Reeves. She took one deliberate step forward and said, in a voice that was level and carried clearly in the concrete space, "Whatever's in that case, finishing it is not the move you want to make right now." He looked at her. His hands had gone still. "There are federal agents 20 feet behind me and more on the way," she said. "You heard the radio." She took another step, slow, the way you moved in this kind of situation. Not advancing, just reducing distance, keeping the energy of the interaction in a register that didn't push him toward a decision she couldn't walk back. "What's already been placed in this corridor, you and I both know it's enough. You don't need to add to it." "Stop moving," he said. His voice was tightly controlled, which told her he was not panicking, which was simultaneously better and worse than panic would have been. She stopped. "You need to understand what happens either way," she said. "If you close that case and come with me, this ends with you in custody and alive. If you activate anything in that corridor, you're in it same as I am, and those are concrete walls, and there is no outcome from that which is good for you. It's not for me, he said. She processed that sentence. Remote trigger. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She looked at the walls. She'd walked this corridor once, 3 weeks ago, and she hadn't been looking for place charges. She'd been learning the building's layout, the access points, the geography. She'd registered the corridor as a utility space. She had not registered what might be taped inside the pipe housings, under the cable trays, behind the junction boxes that ran along the south wall at 18-inch intervals. Now she looked at those junction boxes with different eyes. 4 of them had a slightly different profile than the others. Thicker, the kind of thick that came from something added rather than something manufactured. She counted them without moving her head enough to make it obvious she was counting. "Walk me through the trigger setup," she said. He looked at her like she'd said something in the wrong language. "Not to disarm it," she said. "I'm not trained for that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Because if I move toward any of those junction boxes, there's no way you read that as anything but a disarm attempt, and this conversation ends in the worst way it can end. I'm asking because I need to understand the activation window, and you need someone to talk to who isn't pointing a weapon at you." A long beat. "You're the nurse," he said finally. "Yes." "You're the one who took down Voss and Martel." She assumed those were the men upstairs. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not toward warmth, nothing like that, but toward something more complicated. The look of a man who had built a plan on certain assumptions and was now watching those assumptions fail one by one. 15 minutes, he said. She felt the floor of her stomach drop exactly 1 inch, in a controlled way. 15 minutes on a remote-triggered device meant the trigger had already been sent or was on a timer, not in his hands, which meant she had 15 minutes from an unknown starting point, and she had no idea when that starting point was. "When did the clock start?" she said. "When Voss didn't check in." Voss was the man from the stairwell, the man she'd put on the floor of the ICU corridor. He'd been down for, she ran it quickly, approximately 23 minutes. She turned her head toward the door behind her without looking away from him. "Reeves." "I'm here." The deputy director's voice was steady, which she appreciated. "EOD, now. I need EOD in this corridor in the next 8 minutes, and I need the building cleared of non-essential personnel immediately." She turned back to the man with the case. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "It doesn't matter for anything that happens in the next 8 minutes, she said. "I'm asking because I can't keep calling you him in my head." "Garrett," he said. It might have been true. "Garrett, is the trigger device in that case?" "What's left of the setup?" "Is it shielded?" He looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. "Yes." Which meant jamming wouldn't work, if they had a jammer, which she wasn't sure they did. She ran through what she knew about IED construction in the fast, practical way she'd learned it. Not from a classroom, from the kind of situation where the classroom equivalent would have arrived too late to be useful. Shielded trigger receiver. Remote signal. Present. Timer is failsafe or primary mechanism. "The receiver," she said. "Is it on a dead man switch or does it need an active signal?" Garrett looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding how much this cost him to answer. "Active signal." Active signal. Present active signal meant there was a transmitter somewhere that was broadcasting continuously, and the receiver was listening for it, and when it stopped receiving, dead man switch in reverse, essentially, the secondary timer kicked in as failsafe. "Where's the transmitter?" He didn't answer. "Garrett." "You're not EOD?" he said. "You can't—" "I know I can't," she said. "I need to know if it's in this building." A pause that lasted long enough that she counted it. 4 seconds. 5. "East parking structure," he said. "3rd level. Gray utility van." She turned to the door again. "Reeves. Gray utility van, east parking structure, 3rd level. We need that vehicle isolated immediately. Don't approach it, don't touch it. Set a perimeter and get EOD to it first." Reeves was already on the radio. She could hear the controlled urgency of it through the door. She turned back to Garrett. "You have options," she said. "Fewer than you did 10 minutes ago, but you have them." He looked at the case in front of him. He looked at the corridor walls. He looked at her. "Why are you talking to me?" he said. "You could have sent them in." Because sending them in at the wrong speed gets people hurt, she said, and because you haven't done anything yet that can't be survived. She paused. I'm not being kind about it. I'm being accurate. Activating that device is the only thing you can do right now that ends this in a way you don't walk away from. Everything else, you walk away from. He sat back on his heels and looked at the ceiling of the corridor, which was a thing people did when they were very tired and had run out of forward momentum. Then he put his hands on his knees, palms up, away from the case. Tell your people, he said. Tell them to come in slow. She let out a breath that she'd been holding so carefully she'd almost forgotten it was held. Reeves, she said. Slow, hands visible, no weapons drawn, single file. The EOD team arrived at Coastal Ridge 11 minutes later, which was fast enough that someone had clearly been positioned nearby, which told Mara that the federal presence tonight had anticipated something more significant than two men with handguns. They came in with the particular efficiency of people who did dangerous work routinely and had organized their relationship with that fact into a set of protocols that left no room for improvisation. She cleared the corridor the moment they arrived, not because anyone told her to, because it was the correct thing to do, and she had done what she could do in there, and anything more would have been interference. She went back up to the third floor and sat in the corridor again, in the same spot against the wall, and this time nobody asked her to do anything for a while, and she was grateful for that. The building evacuation had been partial. Non-critical patients moved to the interior wards away from the east side. ICU patients held in place because moving ICU patients created its own set of risks that had to be weighed against the risk of staying, and the clinical staff had made those assessments fast and without drama, which was what clinical staff at a military hospital were built to do. The ER had gone to diversion, which meant incoming cases were being rerouted to St. Anselm's across the bay, which meant someone was going to have to explain this night to the regional medical command in the morning. Dr. Rachel Yoon appeared in the corridor at some point during that stretch. Mara didn't track the exact time, still in her attending jacket, clearly not yet off shift. She looked at Mara against the wall and at the gauze taped somewhat crookedly to Mara's cheekbone and at the general state of her, and she pulled on a pair of gloves and crouched down. Let me look at that, she said. Mara let her. Yoon examined the split with a penlight and the efficient, unprecious manner of an ER physician who had seen considerably worse and was not going to perform sympathy she didn't feel. You need 2 stitches minimum, probably 3. I know. You want to do it here or come to the bay? Here's fine. Yoon went and came back with a suture kit in less than 3 minutes, which was fast enough that Mara understood she'd had it ready before she asked. She numbed the site and closed the split with 3 interrupted sutures and taped it without saying anything about how it got there or what Mara had been doing when it happened. When she was done, she stripped her gloves and looked at Mara with an expression that was difficult to read. Holt's been on the phone with hospital administration since 2200, she said. About me. About the written notice. About the unauthorized access to the ICU records. A pause. About whether someone with your apparent history should have been given access to this hospital. Mara looked at the wall across from her. He doesn't know my history. No, Yoon said. He doesn't. Another pause. But he's been in the building tonight. He knows what happened up here, and he's been on the phone anyway. She said it without editorial, just information presented at face value. What are you telling me? Mara said. I'm telling you that the conversation about your employment is happening right now in the administrative offices on the 2nd floor while you're sitting in this corridor with 3 stitches in your face. She stood up. I thought you should know where it was happening. She walked away. Os. The EOD team cleared the corridor at 2388, which meant the charges had been rendered safe and the transmitter vehicle had been neutralized without incident, which was the outcome everyone needed and not the one anyone had been guaranteed. The debrief that followed was the kind of multi-agency coordination event that Mara had participated in before, in different buildings, in a different capacity, and she answered every question asked of her with the same clinical accuracy she'd applied to everything else tonight. Garrett, whose real name turned out to be Warren Price, was in custody. Voss and Martel were in custody. The protective detail guard with the concussion was being monitored. Captain Douglas Rourke was in his room, stable, awake, and had apparently asked 3 times whether the nurse who'd come through his door was all right, which Mara found out from Agent Fisk, and which she filed away without reacting to. She asked Fisk, at some point after midnight, about the network. "How many total?" she said. 8 individuals that we've identified," Fisk said. "Price's crew was the operational arm. The rest of the structure is administrative. Procurement fraud, contract manipulation, the kind of thing that takes 2 years to prosecute properly. But tonight gives us the leverage to move on the whole chain." "Who was running it?" Fisk looked at her steadily. "That's an ongoing investigation." "I understand that. I'm asking anyway." A pause. "There's a name that comes up in Price's communications that we've been looking at for 18 months. A defense contractor named Aldrich Vorn. Mid-level, publicly. Private consulting, retired Navy, the kind of resume that opens doors. Privately, he's been coordinating the obstruction of Rourke's program because it was going to restructure a procurement channel that Vorn's network had been monetizing for 6 years." She paused. "Rourke knew about Vorn. That's why he ended up in that bed." Mara looked at the door to room 14. "The collapse of Rourke's program wouldn't have just protected Vorn's revenue," she said. "It wasn't a question. She was working it through out loud. It would have exposed who Rourke had briefed, who had the same information." "Yes," Fisk said. "So Rourke wasn't the only target tonight." Fisk looked at her for a long moment. "No, he wasn't." The administrative meeting that Dr. Yoon had mentioned was apparently still ongoing at 0100 because Lauren Vasquez appeared in the corridor for the second time that night with the particular expression of someone who has been in that meeting and has come directly from it. She sat down next to Mara again. "Holt filed a formal complaint," she said. "He cited the radiology order, the badge access issue, which they now know wasn't you, but the complaint was filed before that was confirmed. And tonight. Specifically, your unauthorized presence in the building and your unauthorized engagement with the individuals in the ICU." "Unauthorized engagement," Mara said. "That's what he called it." "The man in room 14 is alive." "Yes," Lauren said. "And Holt's complaint is in writing." Mara looked at the corridor ceiling. She thought about the conversation she'd had with herself 2 nights ago in her car, the one about what she was willing to do and what it would cost. She had not fully answered that question then. She seemed to be answering it now, incrementally, whether she'd intended to or not. "Administration is meeting with federal liaisons in the morning," Lauren continued. "Fisk's office has already sent a preliminary communication. I don't know what it says." She paused. "What I do know is that Dex Holloway went home at shift end and told 3 people in the parking lot that you'd gotten someone shot in the ICU." "Nobody got shot," Mara said. "1 round went into the ceiling." "I know." "The ceiling got shot." "I know, Mara." She rubbed the back of her hand across her mouth and looked at the floor for a moment. "Holt's complaint. Is it going to HR or directly to credentialing?" "HR first, but if administration decides tonight was a liability event, it's going to credentialing. Possibly." Mara nodded. She processed it with the kind of flatness that wasn't absence of feeling, but was the thing she did when feelings were not currently useful. She'd figure out what she felt about it later. Right now, she had enough information, and she didn't need more. "Go home," she said to Lauren. "You've been here since 10 on your day off. So have you." "I lived 3 years of coming home at weird hours," Mara said. "Go." Lauren stood up slowly, like someone whose body had decided it was done. She looked down at Mara with that same complex expression from before. The one that was still reconciling the 3 weeks of working together with the last 4 hours of corridor floor. "For what it's worth," Lauren said, "I told them exactly what I saw. In the meeting. I said I had never seen a nurse do what you do, and I didn't mean it the way Holt would mean it." She left. Mara sat alone in the corridor for a while after that. Reeves found her at 0130, which was when the bulk of the federal activity had shifted from the building to the vehicles outside, and the corridor had thinned out to a few remaining agents doing final documentation sweeps. He came and stood in front of her rather than crouching, which she read as a deliberate choice. He was treating her as an equal in standing rather than someone who needed to be met at her level. "Price is talking," he said. "He started talking about 40 minutes ago, and he hasn't stopped." "About Vorn." "About the whole structure, 6 years of it." He paused. "It's more than we had. Significantly more. Some of it we didn't know." "What happens now?" "In the next 12 hours, we execute warrants on 14 individuals across 3 states. Vorn is at the top of that list. He looked at her with the same careful attention from before. None of that happens without tonight. Tonight was not a plan, she said. I want to be clear about that. Tonight was a series of responses to a situation I didn't have full information on. I know, he said. That's what makes it more impressive, not less. She looked at him. Is that the part where you tell me what you want from me? He almost smiled. I was going to wait until morning. Don't, she said. I'm sitting on a hospital corridor floor at 1:30 in the morning with stitches in my face. Just say it. He was quiet for a moment. We have a unit, he said. It's small. It operates inside existing institutional frameworks, medical facilities, logistical hubs, places where someone with your combination of skills and cover can function without creating the kind of profile that gets people killed. We've been building it for 3 years. A pause. The person who was supposed to run the medical division resigned 8 months ago. She looked at the floor. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, he said. I told you. I was going to wait until morning. You're asking tonight, she said. You just said you'd wait. Another near smile. The offer is there. That's all I'm saying. He walked away. She sat with it for a while. The offer was not a surprise. The shape of it had been visible since Fisk had crouched in front of her and asked what she'd done before nursing, since Reeves had said we've been looking for you for 3 years with that particular tone of someone who meant it precisely. She'd been aware, in a background way, that tonight was not just a crisis being resolved. It was also a demonstration, and it was being watched. What she didn't know yet was how she felt about that. What she knew was that she was very tired, and that her shoulder ached in a deep, structural way that was going to be a problem for the next 10 days, and that she had 3 stitches in her cheekbone, and that Holt's complaint was sitting in an HR file 2 floors below her, and that somewhere in an administrative conference room, the question of her employment was being decided by people who had one version of who she was. At 0200, she stood up. She was stiff in the way that bodies get stiff when they've been forced through something intense and then sat cold for an hour afterward. She worked her shoulder in a slow rotation, not enough to help it, just enough to remind it she was aware of it, and she walked the length of the corridor to the nursing station. The night shift nurse there, a woman she didn't know, pulled in from another floor during the crisis and apparently not yet released, looked up at her with the wary attention of someone who had heard about tonight secondhand and was not sure how to categorize the person in front of her. I'm Sloane, Mara said. ER. Is Dr. Yoon still in the building? She left about an hour ago. Is there a senior attending currently on? Dr. Margolis, he's in the East Wing. Mara nodded. She turned to look at room 14. Has Captain Rourke slept? She said. Not that I've seen. She walked to room 14 and knocked once on the doorframe and went in. Rourke was sitting up in his bed the same way he'd been sitting up when she'd last seen him. The IV lines moved to accommodate the new position, the central line running its slow drip, the cardiac monitor producing the steady, unspectacular readout of someone whose heart was doing its job despite a difficult evening. He looked better than he had any right to. Military men who had been in certain kinds of service had a particular quality of durability that was not invincibility. She knew exactly how wrong that was, but was close enough to be visible. He looked at her when she came in, at the stitches, at the way she was holding her left arm slightly away from her body. Sit down before you fall down, he said. She sat in the chair beside his bed. Reeves tell you the name? Rourke said. He meant Vorn. Yes. He nodded. Not with satisfaction, with the flat, grim acknowledgement of someone who has known a thing for a long time and is watching it finally become real for other people. I've been trying to get traction on Vorn for 14 months, he said. Every time I brought documentation forward, it disappeared. Twice I was told I was misinterpreting the procurement data. Once I was told the source had been discredited. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but dark and his own reflection. You know what they didn't do? They didn't tell me I was wrong. Because you weren't, she said. No. A pause. I wasn't. She looked at the cardiac monitor and then at the IV lines, old habit, checking the mechanical picture of a person's status the same way she did on rounds. Everything looked appropriate. You should try to sleep, she said. Probably. He didn't move toward it. They're going to bring you in front of the credentialing board. Holt's complaint. Holt's complaint is going to go away, Rourke said. The Federal Communication to Administration is going to make that clear by 0800 tomorrow. What I'm telling you is that even after it goes away, they're going to want to know who you are. He looked at her directly. And the answer to that question is not currently in your personnel file. She looked at him. I'm not asking, he said. I was in special operations logistics for 12 years before I went into program management. I know what I was looking at when you came through that door. He paused. I'm telling you that the question is coming, and how you answer it is going to determine what happens next for you in this building. She was quiet for a moment. What would you answer? She said. He considered it. I'd tell them the truth, he said. Not all of it, and not out of order, but the shape of it. Another pause. People who underestimate you are going to keep underestimating you until they have a reason not to. Tonight gave them a reason. What you do with that is up to you. She sat with that for a moment in the quiet room with the monitor beeping its steady, unremarkable rhythm. Then she said, Get some sleep, Captain. She stood up and walked back to the door. She was in the doorway when he said, What's your name, your actual name? She looked back at him. Mara Sloane, she said. That's my actual name. He nodded. She went back to the corridor. She sat down in the chair that had been placed there for the protective detail, the chair with the clear sightline in both directions. And she looked at the empty hallway and thought about what Rourke had said about the shape of truth and how much of it to give and when. She thought about Holt's complaint in the credentialing board and the version of her that existed in official documentation versus the version that had just spent 4 hours in this building. She thought about Reeves and the offer he'd said he wasn't making tonight. And she thought about a thing she hadn't let herself think about directly yet, which was the moment she'd come off the floor in the ICU corridor and moved, for the first time in 3 years, with the full specific weight of everything she'd been before. Not reluctantly, not with the kind of internal negotiation she'd expected to need, just cleanly, because someone needed it, and she was the one there, and those two facts had resolved all the other questions without asking her permission. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She thought she might not be sure for a while. At 0230, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different area code this time, not local. She answered it. The voice on the other end was one she recognized immediately because she had spent 6 months working under it and another 18 months trying not to think about it, and the fact that it was calling her now, in this building, at this hour, meant that the evening was not as contained as she had believed. Sloane, the voice said. We have a problem. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Vorn is gone, the voice said. He went dark at 2200. Before the warrants, someone tipped him. She opened her eyes. And there's something else, the voice said. Something in Price's communications that came up in the last hour. The operation tonight. It wasn't just Rourke. She already knew that. Fisk had told her. There was a secondary target, the voice said. Not in the building. The secondary target was whoever interrupted the primary. A pause that was very controlled. They didn't know who you were before tonight, Sloane. They do now. The corridor was empty and very quiet. There are 2 people outside your apartment building right now, the voice said. She was on her feet before the voice finished the sentence. Not from panic. Panic was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford it. But from the immediate, practical reorganization of everything she'd been sitting with for the last hour into a new configuration. The tiredness was still there. The shoulder was still a problem. The stitches in her cheekbone pulled slightly when she set her jaw. None of that changed what the next 60 seconds needed to look like. Who is this? She said, because she recognized the voice, but she needed to say it out loud to confirm that she wasn't wrong about the recognition. Danica Morrow, the voice said. I'm NCIS Liaison, Joint Task Force. I worked with your unit in the Kessler operation, 2021. You won't have my name on record, but I have yours. She did remember the Kessler operation, in the way she remembered all of it. Not fondly, not with nostalgia, just as information that lived in a particular part of her memory that she didn't visit often. How did you get this number? Reeves, Morrow said. He brought me in 2 hours ago when Vorn went dark. I'm in the mobile command outside your building right now. My apartment. Yes. The 2 people outside. 1 male, 1 female. They've been stationary for 11 minutes. We're watching them, but we haven't moved on them yet because we don't know if there are more and we don't want to flush the ones we can see before we've swept the block. Mara was already moving down the corridor toward the elevator, her bag over her shoulder, running the geometry of it. Her apartment was 6 minutes from Coastal Ridge by car, 8 minutes at this hour if she obeyed the lights, which she would, because getting stopped added variables she didn't need. Don't move on them until I'm there, she said. A brief pause. Ms. Sloane, they know my face now, she said. They don't know yours. If you move on them before I'm there, you tell them how much you know, and Vorn finds out within an hour. I can end this faster if I'm present. Another pause. Longer. 12 minutes, Morrow said. 8, Mara said. I'll be there in 8. She hit the stairwell and went down. She made it in 9 minutes, which was 1 more than she'd said, but 4 less than she'd told Morrow she would need, and the extra minute came from taking a route that added 2 blocks in exchange for approaching from the east rather than the north, which put the building's loading bay between her and the 2 stationary figures she could already see from half a block away. A dark sedan, different car from the one she'd been tracking, but the same profile, was parked at the corner with its lights off and a faint blue glow on the dashboard that meant someone inside was watching a screen. Mobile surveillance. They'd had time to set it up, which meant the decision to move on her had been made while she was still in the hospital, probably while Price was first being questioned, probably the moment someone in Vorn's network understood that the hospital operation had failed completely. She moved along the building's east wall in the particular way she'd moved 100 times before, close to the surface, unhurried, the kind of movement that registered as a person walking home rather than a person approaching a situation. She came around the corner of the loading bay and stopped. Morrow's mobile command was a gray panel van parked on the far side of the street with no identifying markings, which was how she identified it. She crossed to it and knocked twice on the side door in the pattern she would have used if she'd been in joint operation, because some things were universal enough that it was worth trying. The door opened. Morrow was mid-40s, sharp-boned face, the kind of eyes that processed a room in the time it took most people to focus on one part of it. She looked at Mara, at the stitches, at the shoulder, at the general state of her, and moved to make space without commenting on any of it. Talk me through the layout, Mara said, sliding in and closing the door behind her. There were 2 other people in the van, one on communications, one watching a monitor that showed a 4-camera split of the block outside her building. Mara looked at the monitor and located the 2 figures immediately. The male was on the building's north side, near the main entrance, positioned as if he was checking his phone. The female was at the south corner, which covered the fire exit. Between them, they had covered both ground floor exits. 3rd floor window, Mara said, pointing at the monitor. My apartment. Is there anyone on the roof? Negative, the comms operator said. We swept it 20 minutes ago. Is that sweep current? He looked at his watch. 19 minutes. Check it again, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. A 19-minute gap is a 19-minute gap. He got on the radio. Morrow was watching her. What are you thinking? These 2 aren't here to grab me, Mara said. If this was an extraction, they'd have more people and a vehicle staged closer. These 2 are surveillance. They're here to confirm my location and call it in, which means Vorn doesn't know where he's going yet. He's still running. She looked at the monitor. If we take these 2 quietly, we have whatever communication channel they're using, and we have the window to trace it before Vorn knows the feed went dark. Morrow looked at the monitor. We need them talking. Yes. Can you do that? Mara looked at the female figure at the south corner. The woman. I know that posture. She didn't explain how. She's been in this work long enough to know when something is wrong before it happens. If she sees federal credentials, she shuts down. She paused. She won't shut down for a neighbor who's having a bad night. Morrow looked at her for a long moment. You just came out of a 4-hour operational situation. Yes. You have stitches in your face. That actually helps, Mara said. I look like someone who's been through something, which I have. She looked at the monitor. I'm going out the alley exit and coming around from the east. Give me 4 minutes before you move on the male. When she sees you take him, I'm already there, and her first instinct is going to be to look for someone who isn't federal. Morrow was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then she said, You understand I cannot officially authorize you to do this. I understand that, Mara said, and you're doing it anyway. 4 minutes, Mara said. She opened the van door and slipped out. The night was cold enough that her breath showed, which was useful because it was normal, and normal was the entire argument. She came around the east end of the block with her bag on her shoulder and her collar turned up and her head slightly down. which was how people walked alone at this hour when they were tired, not looking at things, pointed toward a destination. She had her keys out, which was what a person did when they were coming home, and wanted to waste as little time as possible between outside and inside. The woman at the south corner clocked her at about 40 feet. Mara didn't look at her. She looked at the building door because that was what she would look at if she were just coming home. She fumbled with the keys in the cold, an old habit from years ago that had become a genuine behavioral tic. The fumble was real because her hands were slightly uncoordinated from fatigue, and the adrenaline that had been running through her system for the last 3 hours was finally metabolizing into something that felt like a full-body tremor suppressed just below the surface. She got the door open. From behind her, she heard the sound of Moro's people moving on the north side, quick, controlled, the specific kind of sound that trained surveillance personnel recognized instantly. The woman at the south corner made her decision in less than 2 seconds, which was fast, and moved toward the building's fire exit, which was the wrong direction from the van and the right direction if you were trying to create distance from a federal approach. Mara let the building door go and stepped in front of the fire exit. The woman pulled up short. She was in her 30s, dark hair, dressed for invisibility, in the same way the man Mara had followed into the corridor had been dressed. She looked at Mara, and the calculation ran across her face. This was a civilian, just a resident, wrong place, wrong time. "I need to get through," the woman said. "I know," Mara said. Something in the way she said it, the specific flatness of it, the absence of the alarm or confusion the woman had expected, made the woman's eyes change. "I need to get through right now," the woman said, and her hand moved. "Don't," Mara said, very quietly. "There are 6 federal officers on this block, and 2 more on the roof that you didn't know about. What you do with your hand in the next 2 seconds determines whether you go in front of a judge or don't make it to the van." The hand stopped. "Voren is already running," Mara said. "The network knows the hospital operation failed. Whatever you were told about what happens if you deliver my location, whoever told you that is on a plane or a boat or in a car going the opposite direction from you right now. You are the expendable part of this." She held the woman's gaze. "Tell me how the communication channel works." A long pause. Moro appeared at the corner of the building. The woman looked at Moro, looked at Mara, looked at the fire exit that was now blocked, and the federal officer behind her and the 6 she'd been told were on the block. "There's an app," she said, "encrypted. It pings every 7 minutes. If I don't respond to the ping, they know the location is burned." "When's the next ping?" Mara said. The woman checked the watch on her wrist. The old kind. Analog, simple. The kind you used when you didn't want a device that could be traced. 3 minutes. "Give Moro your phone," Mara said, "and respond to the ping. If I respond, they'll think the location is still live." "Yes," Mara said. The woman understood what she was being asked, to help them run a trace, to buy the time for Moro's team to follow the signal back, while Voren still believed he had eyes on the situation. She understood what it cost her to do it, and what it cost her not to. She handed the phone to Moro. The trace took 19 minutes. It would have taken 12, but the signal bounced twice, which was expected for someone who had been running this kind of network for 6 years and knew the basic operational security of not broadcasting from a fixed location. The bounce points were a server cluster in a state 300 miles away and a routing node that told them the originating signal was mobile, someone moving, not stationary, which confirmed what Mara had said about Voren running. At Yo318, the trace resolved to a vehicle on Interstate 95, southbound, 42 miles from Brenton Bay. Moro was on the phone before the resolution completed. Mara sat on the building's front step in the cold and listened to the coordination happen around her and felt the specific quality of exhaustion that was different from tiredness, the kind that came when your body had been running on emergency reserves for long enough that the reserves were genuinely depleted, and the thing keeping you upright was less physiology and more something harder to name. At 0341, Morrow came and sat next to her on the step. "Virginia State Police made the stop," she said. "He was in a rental, civilian plates, traveling alone." A pause. He had a go bag, passport under a different name, credit cards. Another pause. He had a laptop with the full financial architecture of the procurement network on it, encrypted, but our forensic team says it's recoverable. Mara looked at the street. He thought he had time, she said. He thought the operation tonight would buy him 48 hours minimum. Morrow paused. He didn't account for the fact that it would fail in under 4. She didn't say because of you. She didn't need to. The 2 individuals from outside your building, Morrow continued, are being processed. The woman is cooperating. The man from the north side has been identified as a former defense intelligence contractor with documented ties to 3 of the 8 individuals in the network. She paused. With Vorn in custody and Price still talking, the warrants that were supposed to go out at 0800 moved to 0430. We're executing all 14 simultaneously. 14 people. 6 years of procurement fraud, obstruction, and a network built on the assumption that the right doors would always be open to the right names. Rourke's program, Mara said. We'll go forward, Morrow said, without the interference. His documentation was sound from the beginning. Vorn's people had been intercepting and misfiling the reports before they reached the committee level. All of that is in Price's communications. She was quiet for a moment. Captain Rourke has been briefed, as of 30 minutes ago. Mara nodded. The street was empty in both directions. A street light at the corner was doing that thing where it flickered on a slow cycle, not dramatically, just a brief periodic dimming and return, like something breathing. She watched it without much thought. The offer from Reeves, Morrow said. I know. You haven't answered it. It's been 4 hours. I know, Morrow said, but I've been doing this for 11 years and I've worked with a lot of people and I've been in a lot of operational situations, and the number of people who would have done what you did tonight. She stopped, reconsidered. The way you did it, the sequence, the choices. That's not common. Mara looked at the flickering streetlight. I didn't do it because I wanted to go back, she said. I did it because there was a man in a room who was going to be hurt, and I was the person standing there. I know, Morrow said. That's actually the point. She slept 4 hours, in her apartment, in her own bed, with the knowledge that there were still federal officers on the block outside, and that Aldrich Vorn was in a vehicle somewhere on Interstate 95 in the back of a Virginia State Police unit, and that 14 warrants were executing across 3 states, and that the woman in her building's south doorway had given them the communication channel that had made all of that happen 40 minutes earlier than it otherwise would have. She slept badly, which was normal. She woke at 0830 and lay still for a moment and took inventory of her body the way she always did after something physical. The shoulder was worse in the morning, stiff and deeply unhappy. The cheekbone was swollen around the stitches. Her back ached from the floor of the hospital corridor. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the wall. She thought about what Rourke had said about the shape of the truth, about how much of it to give and when. She thought about the credentialing board meeting that was apparently happening today. She decided she was going to go to. The meeting was at 100, in a conference room on the second floor of Coastal Ridge's administrative wing, and she walked into it in her own clothes. Not scrubs, not a uniform, just clothes, because she was not currently on shift and she was not going to perform either role for this particular audience. The room had a rectangular table and 6 people around it: the hospital's chief of staff, a Dr. Wendell Parrish, who Mara had met once in passing, the director of nursing services, 2 administrative officers, Agent Nora Fisk, and seated at the far end, looking like a man who had arrived with a specific intention and was currently revising it, Dr. Patrick Holt. Mara sat down across from Holt. She did not look at him first. She looked at Parrish, because Parrish was running the meeting, and that was the appropriate direction for her attention. Ms. Sloane, Parrish said. He was in his 60s, the kind of administrator who had come up through clinical medicine and still remembered what it actually looked like. Thank you for coming, Of course, she said. I want to be direct about why we're here. He looked at the file in front of him. There is a personnel complaint filed by Dr. Holt that references two specific incidents and one incident from last night. Agent Fisk has provided a communication from NCIS that addresses the events of last night in considerable detail. He paused. What I'd like is to hear from you directly. She had decided, sitting at her kitchen table this morning, that she was going to do exactly what Rourke had told her. Tell the truth, in order, in the shape it actually had. Not the version that made her sound extraordinary. Not the version that minimized what had happened, the actual shape of it. So she told them. She told them about the sedan, about the phone calls, about the badge access and what she'd inferred from it and why. She told them about walking the maintenance corridor on her first day and why she'd done that. Because it was what she did when she went somewhere new, because that habit was deep enough that she'd stopped being able to turn it off and had learned to live alongside it instead. She told them about the decision she'd made in the parking lot and the decisions she'd made in the corridor and in room 14, including the ones that hadn't worked cleanly and the one where she'd taken the hit to the solar plexus because she'd miscalculated his recovery speed. She told them that she had served as a special operations combat medic for 8 years before leaving the military 3 years ago. She told them that she had not put that in her personnel file because she had been trying, in a way that had been only partially successful, to build a life that wasn't organized around the things she'd had to become during those years. She told them that she was aware that was a choice she'd made that had consequences, including for the people around her who had been working with a version of her that was real but incomplete. She did not apologize for any of it. She sat back when she was done and waited. Parrish was quiet for a long moment. The director of nursing was making a note. The administrative officers looked like people who had come prepared for one kind of meeting and were now in a different kind. Holt had not moved or spoken since she sat down. Fisk spoke first. For the record, she said, the NCIS communication addresses each element of Dr. Holt's complaint in the context of the events of last night. The unauthorized ICU access, established as a credential clone, no involvement by Miss Sloane. The unauthorized radiology order. The clinical outcome was the prevention of a spinal injury in a 24-year-old patient. Last night's presence in the building, instrumental in disrupting a coordinated attack on a naval officer and the safe recovery of a dangerous device. She paused. NCIS's position is that Ms. Sloane's actions last night prevented significant loss of life in this building. Parrish looked at Holt. Holt looked at the table. Dr. Holt, Parrish said, is there anything you'd like to add to the complaint as filed? A long silence. No, Holt said. His voice was flat. Is there anything you'd like to withdraw? A longer silence. The complaint stands as filed, Holt said. Then he added, without looking at her, but I'm prepared to acknowledge that the radiology order produced the correct clinical outcome. It was not an apology. It was the most a man like Holt was going to give in a room like this, and she understood that, and she did not wait for more than it was. The complaint will be reviewed in the context of the NCIS communication and the clinical record, Parrish said. Ms. Sloane, your employment at Coastal Ridge is not at risk. We'll need to update your personnel file, formally, with your cooperation, and there will be an HR process, which is required procedurally, but which I expect to be brief given the circumstances. He looked at her steadily. I also want to say, on behalf of this institution, that what you did last night protected the people in this building. That matters. She nodded. Thank you for being direct with us, he said. She stood. She looked at Holt once, not with satisfaction, not with coldness, just steadily, the way she looked at things she was acknowledging and moving past. And then she left the room. Lauren was waiting in the corridor outside. She was holding 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria downstairs, the bad kind, the kind that tasted like it had been sitting since morning, and she held one out without saying anything. Mara took it. They walked together toward the elevator. "How'd it go?" Lauren said. "Holt's complaint is under review. My job is not in question." She paused. He acknowledged the radiology outcome. Lauren made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's as close to sorry as he gets." "I know." "Is it enough?" Mara considered this honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. They waited for the elevator in silence. Lauren was looking at the stitches with the expression of someone who wanted to say something about them and was deciding not to. "The corporal you flagged," Lauren said instead. "Adkins. He had his procedure yesterday morning. He's recovering well. Neurology says he'll have full function." Mara looked at the elevator doors. That was the thing that was easy to lose in the noise of last night. The corporal in Bay 3 who would have gone home with an undiagnosed cord compression. A 24-year-old who would have woken up in 2 weeks or 2 months with something that couldn't be walked back. That had happened before last night. That had happened because she'd noticed something and said something and then found a way to make sure it was acted on, even when the first person she'd said it to had decided she was wrong. That was the work. The actual work. Not last night. Last night was the extraordinary version of a thing that was mostly ordinary, mostly just showing up and paying attention and being willing to say the thing you'd noticed, even when the room wasn't particularly interested in hearing it. "Good," she said. The elevator opened. They got in. Reeves called at 1400 while she was in the ER, finishing a shift she'd picked up to fill the gap left by the overnight chaos. She stepped into the corridor to take it. "Vorn was arraigned at noon," he said, without preamble. "Federal charges, conspiracy, obstruction, procurement fraud, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in relation to the attacks on Rourke and the secondary target." A pause. "The secondary target being you." She was quiet. "All 14 individuals were taken into custody during the EO 430 sweep. The financial architecture on Vorn's laptop is recoverable. Our forensics team has been through about 30% of it, and the picture is more complete than we thought. The network was moving about 40 million in fraudulent contracts annually across 6 years. He paused. "It's going to be a significant prosecution, the kind that takes 2 years and lands everyone involved with sentences they don't walk away from quickly. Rourke's program," she said, "goes forward with full documentation restored. The committee was briefed this morning." She looked at the ER through the small window in the corridor door. A patient in Bay 2 was talking to Brianna with the animated, slightly over-explaining energy of someone who was nervous and dealing with it through volume. A monitor in Bay 4 was cycling through an alert that was clearly non-critical because nobody was moving toward it with urgency. The board had 6 names on it, and 2 were pending labs. Ordinary. Exactly ordinary. "The offer," Reeves said. "I know why you're calling," she said. "I'm calling about the offer." "I know." She looked at the board through the window. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" "I'm not going to come back the way you want me to," she said. "Not full-time. Not operationally." She paused because she wanted to say the next part correctly. "But I think there's something in between what I was and what I've been trying to be. Something that uses what I know without requiring me to become it again entirely. She paused again. I don't know yet exactly what that looks like. I'm being honest with you about that. That's more honest than most people are, Reeves said. Rourke's program, she said, the restructured procurement framework. Does it have a medical logistics component? A brief pause. It will. Then I think that's where I start, she said. Not in the field, in the architecture. Making sure the systems that support people doing what I used to do are built in a way that doesn't get them killed because someone like Vorn decided the contracts were more important than the people using the equipment. Reeves was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking. That's not a small thing you just described, he said. I know, she said. We'll talk, he said. Formally. When you're ready. Give me 2 weeks, she said. I have a shift to finish. She hung up and went back into the ER. Bob. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. That was the thing about real change. It didn't look like the moment. It looked like the accumulation of mornings after the moment. It looked like Mara Sloane showing up to a shift at Coastal Ridge and doing the work the same way she'd always done it, except that the people around her were doing it with a slightly different understanding of who she was and what she was capable of, and that understanding shifted the texture of things in ways that were small and cumulative and real. Dex Holloway stopped making comments at the station, not because he was told to, and not, she suspected, because he'd experienced some profound interior change. He stopped because the version of her he'd been performing his commentary for, the quiet newcomer who absorbed it in silence, had been replaced by a more complete version, and performing that commentary at the complete version felt different to him. People were like that. They were not usually changed by information. They were changed by the way information reorganized the picture of a person they'd already built. Dr. Holt continued to work at Coastal Ridge. He was not a villain in the movie sense. He was a particular kind of person, the kind that accumulated certainty over years until certainty became a wall, and walls were easier to build around than tear down. He did not become her advocate. He did not become warm. What he became, over time, was slightly more careful. She noticed 2 months after the credentialing meeting that he had ordered an MRI on a back pain case without waiting for a nurse to flag it. She did not comment on it. She noted it and moved on. Some things changed slowly. Some things didn't change at all. She was not interested in a version of this story where everything resolved into neatness. Corporal Adkins came back to the ER 8 weeks after his procedure. He was on crutches, temporary. His neurology team had been clear about that. And he'd come to return a blanket someone had put over him during the wait on his original visit that he'd accidentally taken home. He stood at the desk looking slightly embarrassed about this, the way young service members sometimes looked when they weren't in a context where they knew the rules. Mara happened to be at the station. You can just leave it at the desk, she said. He put it on the counter. Then he looked at her with the specific look of someone who has been told something by someone else and is now reconciling it with the person in front of them. You're the one who flagged my case, he said. Aren't you? She picked up a chart. Your surgical team did the work. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He was 24, which she had known from his chart, and in person he was 24 in a way that was both younger and older than that number usually implied. He'd been through something already in his service, the way military people at that age often had, and it showed in the deliberate quality of how he held himself even on crutches. I noticed something, she said. I made sure it got looked at. The attending told my family it was a musculoskeletal strain, he said. They were going to discharge me. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. It was simple, and he meant it, and he didn't over-ornament it, which was the right way to say thank you for a thing like that. She nodded. He turned and went, awkward on the crutches but steady, the way someone was steady when they were getting better rather than getting worse. She watched him go. The ER was doing what ERs did, cycling through its ordinary extraordinary. And the board had new names on it, and a monitor was alarming softly in Bay 1. And Brianna was on the phone at the station with the specific tone she used when she was dealing with the lab results she disagreed with. All of it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Lauren appeared at the station and set a chart down and said, without looking up, Bay 3 needs a second line. Patient's a hard stick. I'll take it, Mara said. She picked up what she needed and went. That was the thing that she had not been able to explain to Reeves, and had not tried to, because it was not something that translated well into the language of offers and operations and institutional roles. The thing was that she had spent 3 years trying to find a version of herself that was enough, that did enough good, that didn't require her to carry so much, that let her sleep and eat reheated rice at her kitchen table and have something that felt like an ordinary life. And she had been close to it. She had been genuinely close. What last night had taught her, what this morning had confirmed and the corporal on crutches had underscored, was not that the ordinary life was a failure. It was that the ordinary life was the point, the reason any of it mattered. The people in the beds and the monitors cycling and the charts that needed updating and the 24-year-old who could walk out on crutches instead of in a wheelchair because someone had paid attention when it counted. That was the mission. It had always been the mission. She had just needed to understand that protecting it sometimes looked like scrubs and sometimes looked like a maintenance corridor at 2 in the morning. And both of those things were the same thing. She was not healed. She was not fixed. She slept badly more nights than not. And the shoulder would take another month to stop complaining. And there were memories she carried that were not going to get lighter with time, just more familiar. She was a person who had done difficult things and was living alongside what those things had cost, the way people did when they'd been places that changed them and couldn't unchange. But she was also a person who showed up, who noticed, who said the things she'd noticed even when the room didn't want to hear it, who was in the end exactly where she was supposed to be. She went into Bay 3 and looked at the patient, 50s, anxious, bad veins, already apologizing for being a difficult stick, and she pulled the chair close and sat down at his level and said, "Let me take a look," in the calm, even voice that she'd developed somewhere between the military and this place, and that was, she had come to understand, entirely her own. She found the vein. She got it on the first try, which she almost always did, and did not make a point of it. The monitor in the bay settled into its rhythm. The patient's shoulders dropped 2 inches as the tension left them. Outside the bay, the ER continued its work, and Mara Sloane, who had been called many things by many people in many rooms, most of them wrong and some of them right, and none of them complete, continued hers.